My name is Molly Kramer, and I'm a graduate student at Morningside College, and I am a second grade teacher. Here's my presentation. My study was called Investigating the Impact of Genius Hour on the Academic Achievement of Second Graders. I really wanted to see how student-centered learning impacted reading comprehension. So that brings me to my problem. I found in the research that teacher-directed learning was really outdated for students that were expected to be 21st century learners. I also learned that this teacher-directed learning could stifle creativity, and that stifled creativity could lead to underachievement in students, and that students weren't applying their knowledge to real-world problems. They instead were just applying it to tests and then forgetting it. So that was something that drove me to really investigate this. I had noticed this in my students as well, that they were not really taking an active role in their learning. So I wanted to see what impact student-centered learning would have on them. So I did some research and looked into the topic of student-centered learning, and I found all different types. I found inquiry learning, I found problem-based learning, I found student-centered instruction, and all of those things had a positive impact on student comprehension. Another thing that I looked into was cooperative learning, because that was another aspect to student-centered learning, was when students worked together collaboratively. I learned that that also had a positive impact on student engagement and student learning. I also, in my research, found that teacher-guided supports were beneficial to students throughout the student-centered learning process, and so that was another thing that this study researched as well, since there was the Genius Hour, which I'll get more into later, and then there were teacher-guided lessons for reading comprehension along with it, topics like rereading and things. So I found in my research that these studies were mostly researching how students' science content knowledge was impacted, and the studies I found were mostly done in middle school and high school settings. And so I wanted to do this in my second grade classroom because there really weren't any studies in an elementary-based school, and there really wasn't much information on how it affected reading comprehension in particular. Through my research, I found that student-centered learning connected to the constructivism theoretical framework, and this is where students construct their own knowledge by interpreting their findings. And this was something that Jean Piaget had a theory with. Another theory by Lev Vygotsky connected to this study with the social interaction piece. That social interaction helps students construct knowledge as well and take ownership of their learning. So the purpose of this study was to test the impact of student-centered learning along with the teacher-guided lessons and what effect that had on student reading comprehension. So I implemented Genius Hour, in which students went through a cycle of brainstorming, researching their topic, completing a project, and then presenting that project. I wanted to see how this impacted reading performance. So my hypothesis going into this study was that students who received the student-centered strategy of Genius Hour with those teacher-guided lessons would have higher reading comprehension scores than the students who received strictly teacher-directed learning. The methods of this study, I conducted a quasi-experimental design. Students were placed into groups by previous grades teachers, and the principal had the authority to move those students around if need be, but the groups were made out of the researcher's control. There were 30 participants in this study. There were 15 in the control group and 15 in the experimental group. 17 of those students were male and 13 of those were female. None of the students had an IEP. 27 students were Caucasian. 2 students were African American and 1 student was biracial. So this intervention took place 1 hour every 6-day cycle, and it occurred in 30-minute increments over the course of 2 days. So on day 5, students would get a teacher-guided lesson in which They learned about a reading comprehension skill such as context clues or rereading or finding main idea and key details, just to name a few. And then on each day 6, students would go through the Genius Hour cycle in which they were responsible for researching a topic and then presenting their findings. This intervention lasted for 10 weeks, and I assessed students with a pretest and post-test through the MAP assessment, and I analyzed that MAP assessment with an independent samples t-test. And that MAP assessment was proven to be reliable with a coefficient of 0.90 to 0.95, and concurrent validity was estimated to be greater than 0.8. So that was the method of assessment that I used. The results that I got weren't quite what I had anticipated with my hypothesis. The control group's means on the post-test were 186, and the experimental group's means were 192. And that sounds good just from the means, but you can see that the p-score indicates that that is not statistically significant. The p-score was 0.135, and so even though there was a lower p-score for the post-test than the pre-test, it still was not to the statistically significant realm. It was still off of that 0.05, which would indicate the significance. And you can see here the graph of the means. Both groups' means did increase. The experimental group had higher means in both the pretest and the post-test, but the experimental group did not outperform themselves enough from the pretest to the post-test, so the results did not confirm the hypothesis. So how this connects to my past research. In my previous research, I found that students can be successful in gaining content knowledge, and I did find this to be true in this study as well. Students did gain content knowledge, and they did gain reading comprehension knowledge as they worked throughout this process. It just was not to the point where it's statistically significant. There wasn't any research indicating that it improved reading comprehension, and this study agreed with that. It did not indicate any significant gains in reading comprehension. Previous research also showed that when creativity is suppressed, that there can be student underachievement. And I found that students, just by observation, were really able to hone their knowledge and take ownership of their knowledge when they had the freedom to choose their own topic. They were very motivated to work. And so I thought this was a good way for students to show their creativity and get to have some student choice. So what implications does this have for Genius Hour? I thought that Genius Hour was beneficial to the students in the study. It was just not proven to be so in a significant way. Based on the mean, students did gain knowledge and skills. But since they are elementary students, one implication I found that students might benefit from more teacher-guided lessons and more structure throughout the Genius Hour cycle process. Each student could be in their own phase, and some students may not have taken enough time in the research phase, or maybe didn't take enough time in completing their project. And so having more structure and more guided lessons to how this might look might have impacted the study. Also, teacher familiarity with student-centered learning may be a factor as well. The more familiar a teacher is in implementing student-centered learning, the bigger impact it could have on students. So the limitations in this study were sample size. 30 students was the bare minimum for the quasi-experimental design that I conducted, and so that was one limitation. Teacher experience was another limitation. This was the teacher's first time implementing a student-centered learning environment such as this, and so that was one limitation. Another limitation was the teacher and student relationships and interactions. Some students were met with more often, and other students were more working more on their own and less guided by the teacher. And so that was one limitation as well, is not all students interacted with the teacher in equal amount. Also, there were several interruptions to our schedule that I had planned for this intervention. We had many snow days and late starts and early outs, and so that impacted the teacher-guided lessons, and it impacted students' work time on their Genius Hour cycle. The nature of student-centered learning makes this study difficult to replicate. Students in this study picked certain topics and worked on them, and if someone were to try to replicate it, they may not pick the same topics, and there may be different resources available to students. So it would be hard to replicate just due to the open-ended nature of student-centered learning. Another limitation was that there's more aspects to reading comprehension, such as fluency. There was no piece that involved fluency in this study, and that has a big impact on reading comprehension. So not all aspects of reading comprehension were covered in this intervention, so that would be a limitation as well. My recommendations for future researchers would be to conduct this study with a larger class size or multiple classes, so that the participant number increased and therefore the results would be more generalizable. I would also recommend for future researchers to implement project deadlines for students to know how long they should be taking in each phase, and some more structure with that. Some students seem to get stuck in certain phases or took not as much time in certain phases as they should have. So another recommendation would be to schedule conference times with students. That way, each student is met with the same amount of time and they have the same opportunity to be guided in their research. Another recommendation I would have would be to implement more teacher-guided lessons, and not just in reading comprehension, but also on student working norms. How students should look when they work in student-centered learning and what pace they should be at. Since this was an elementary students in second grade working on this, so this might have been their first exposure to student-centered learning, so they may not have known how to handle it, and so that would be a good thing to implement, would be lessons on how to handle that. These are the references that I used for my past research, so you can take a look at those as well. And this concludes my research presentation for Genius Hour. Thank you.